I want to stop working. I wish I didn't have to go to work today. These days, this seems to be one of the most common sentiments either uttered aloud or just felt inside of the confines of our own mind. But not because we are simply lazy or because we don't want to contribute to society. No, in fact, I think there is a far greater reason that exists deep down, whether we realize it or not. And that reason is you are most likely not free. We live in the most prosperous, the most peaceful, the most dignified era of human society yet, and yet you are not free. How can this fact be? Well, my hope is that by the end of our conversation today, not only will you understand what I mean, but you'll also be able to see the quote unquote code that runs behind many of the layers of societal programming today, which many people are not particularly aware of. Ultimately, my goal is to shed some light on how I believe that society, that humanity, has collectively organized itself at large to effectively compel you into labor against your will, and that this insight may inspire some of you into action. I realize that this message will not resonate with everyone, and that's okay. I am not trying to speak to everyone. I am not trying to determine what is best for everyone or for society at large. Far greater people than me have tried and failed at that. But rather, I hope to connect with just a few of you, to be the voice that I wish I had when I was struggling to find my own way in this world. Now, before we begin, I would like to first of all apologize if my audio sounds worse than normal. I'm currently traveling in Edinburgh at the moment, and I do not have my full recording setup with me, so please just bear that in mind. With that out of the way, allow me to set the stage for today's discussion. Every single one of us was born into this world, and upon being born, we were met with a series of non-negotiable requirements impressed upon us. For instance, some of the most obvious examples of this might be the requirements to breathe air, to drink water, to consume nutrients. These are basic biological requirements. But beyond examples like that, some of us are also subject to more subtle non-negotiable requirements, because between us and everything from our most basic needs to our grandest desires stands one thing and one thing only in the way: money. And so if you, like 99% of other people, were not born into massive generational wealth or power, there is a very specific non-negotiable requirement impressed upon you in this life, and that is the requirement to acquire money. Now, how does one acquire money? Well, again, for that same 99% of people, there is a very specific script that you are supposed to follow. You are supposed to flow through the education system, become a well-behaved and well-adjusted citizen, and then you're supposed to get a job. And this is where most people find themselves today, perhaps yourself included. But some of you, after landing here, may think to yourself, is this all there is? Is this where I'm meant to be? Why do I feel like I'm struggling when I've done everything that I'm supposed to do? I would suggest it's because you've taken a bad deal. One you never knew you accepted or even had the chance to accept in the first place. Allow me to explain by summarizing everything that I've just said and connecting a few dots in the process. So we've established that you, or me, taking a human form, subjects us to basic biological requirements. And to acquire everything from basic biological requirements to our grandest desires requires one thing, And that one thing is money. And finally, to acquire that money, you must get a quote-unquote job. So in other words, we could say that you are fundamentally compelled to work, to perform labor in exchange for money. This was not a choice that you get to make, unless you are someone who is born into generational wealth or power. Therefore, you are not free. At least not until you've reached the stage of life that we commonly call retirement, which is just simply a way to explain that we've reached a certain point in life where we are free from the compulsion of labor because we've acquired enough financial independence. For most people, this stage in life is only reached at the point at which you no longer are really useful to the workplace. This is not a coincidence. As we continue here, I think you'll begin to see that this is very much a game. Not in the sense that this is not serious or that it's some kind of joke, but in the sense that there is design. There are rules, there are rewards, and there are winners and losers. Now, I also don't mean design in the conspiratorial sense. I mean design in the natural sense. Nature itself is a game or a series of games. And we, of course, are a part of nature. To understand more of what I mean by this, I'd like to take you through a bit of a journey through history. The point I'd like to try and make is that we as humans have been playing this one big, great game for thousands and thousands of years. And that game has been, how do we determine the winners and losers of society, aka the hierarchy? And how do we determine what the winners and losers get, aka the distribution of resources? For instance, a simple explanation of the hierarchy and resource distribution could be the Olympic Games. So after a game, you have someone who wins the gold medal who is the ultimate winner. There is one single person who is the ultimate winner, and they receive the gold medal, the top prize. That's the highest category of this hierarchy. Then you have the next category of the hierarchy, which is composed of the other medalists. So you have the silver medalist and you have the bronze medalist. And then after that, you have the third category of the hierarchy, which is composed of everyone else, and this collectively makes up the losers. All of these people receive nothing. So you essentially have the ultimate winner, the lower level winners, and the losers who get nothing. These are common traits of a typical hierarchy structure. You have a top spot of one or very few people who collects most of the rewards relative to everybody else. Then you have a middle portion who is still kind of considered winners in some sense, who also get a decent amount of the rewards. And then finally, you have the bottom portion, which is composed of by far the most people. But the problem is they're the most people, but they are splitting up the least amount of the rewards amongst themselves. So simple math tells us that anyone who's in the top level of the hierarchy gets the most rewards because the most rewards go to them, and they're splitting these rewards up amongst the least amount of people, and this fact is the opposite for the people on the bottom. So this one big great game that we've been playing for thousands and thousands of years has been played to simply determine how all this works. And interestingly, this game has been played in different ways and in different versions across history. But despite that, the outcome of the game has more or less stayed the same. And of course, this game, in its current version, as it is played today, is the reason why you are where you are today. It has determined where you are in the hierarchy structure of society, and it has determined what resources have been distributed to you. If you don't like where that is, first of all, you're not alone, and I myself was once there. Later in this conversation, I will share how I changed that in my own life by becoming what I call a sovereign individual. But for now, let us turn to history to examine how this great game has been played throughout time, how we've organized ourselves into hierarchies, and how we've determined to distribute our resources. So humans as we know them today have existed for approximately 160,000 years in the anatomically modern form. And for the vast majority of that history, we've actually played the game basically the same way, as hunter-gatherer societies. Think about that for a moment. It's very easy to imagine that the way life exists today is the way that it has always existed, or that how it will always exist into the future. But really, this modern version of the game, this modern version of society, is a blink of the eye when you compare it to the entire span of human history. The whole notion of this life path that we are supposed to follow to ultimately get a job and all of this stuff, it's barely existed for any time at all, and it is not normal. But interestingly though, the concept of a hierarchy seems to have existed for a very, very long time. A comprehensive study published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society found that our results show that hunter-gatherer societies throughout the world exhibit remarkably similar hierarchical organizations. Not only that, but they also found the hierarchical fractal-like organizations of hunter-gatherer social systems is similar to the self-organized structures of other complex systems in nature. In other words, hierarchies have always been a fixture of humanity, and these hierarchical structures have been found throughout nature because they seem to be a way of efficiently distributing resources among complex systems. The study goes on to say, empirical examples of such networks range from the branching tributaries in river drainages to the vascular systems that distribute energy and materials within the bodies of animals and plants. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. We've established that hierarchies exist in nature and they exist in human societies, or rather we've adopted them from nature because they seem to be very effective at efficiently distributing resources. So the next question to ask then is, how has the way we've distributed resources changed over time if this hierarchy structure hasn't really? The thing that I'm curious about is, have societies become more or less equal over time? To answer that question, we'll look at something called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is the most widely used measure to compare equality across different populations, and fortunately for us, it's quite easy to understand. It has a value somewhere between 0 and 1, with 0 being a society that is perfectly equal, and 1 being a society that is perfectly unequal. So in other words, 0 means everyone gets the exact same stuff, and 1 means one person gets everything and everybody else gets nothing. So a society that had a Gini coefficient of 0.2, for example, would be more equal than a society that had a Gini coefficient of 0.7. So to answer the question of how has humanity distributed resources over time and how has that changed over time, we can look at the Gini coefficient of different periods of time. So if we look at hunter-gatherer societies, we can find that the average Gini coefficient of them, as determined by one particular study, shows that it is 0.25, which is roughly similar to modern-day Denmark. I found this very interesting because I think there's a very common conception that hunter-gatherer societies are extremely egalitarian, when that is sort of the case. I mean, they are fairly egalitarian, but there is still some degree of unequalness between the members. So then the question remains, how has that changed as we moved into the agricultural revolution and then as we industrialized as a society? Because those were massive changes. And then finally, how does all of that compare to the modern United States? Well, starting with the Roman Empire in the year 14 and then progressing through the Middle Ages and all the way to modern day America, we can see that fascinatingly, the Gini coefficient has more or less stayed within a relative range that has found its middle ground or average at about 0.4. So it is true then, once we switched from being a hunter-gatherer society, the Gini coefficient had a rather large change going from 0.25 to 0.4. Something definitely shifted there. The hierarchy structure may have not really changed, as we've already established, but the distribution of resources across it seems to have. It seems to have become much less equal. My personal guess is that once we switched from a nomadic hunter-gatherer society to a society that could set up permanent structures, settlements, and stockpile resources, what happened was, because you could stockpile resources, the people at the highest levels of the hierarchy were able to then hoard these resources. This was something that could not have existed before because we didn't really have as effective means of storing resources. Oftentimes as hunter-gatherers, they had to be consumed immediately. So once this change was made, once we were able to build permanent settlements to stockpile resources, and we had a massive population boom, it seems that the distribution of resources became less equal in society. And this has not changed since. No matter which version of this great game we were playing, whether it was slave-based, whether it was feudalism, whether it was monarchies, whether it was capitalism, the Gini coefficient started around 0.36 in the year 14 Rome, it was 0.41 in the Byzantium Empire in the year 1000, and then it was 0.45 in the year 1688 England, and finally it is 0.4 for the modern day United States. In other words, since we stopped being hunter-gatherers, the way we distribute rewards in society has actually gotten slightly worse than it was in the times of ancient Rome. How could that be the case, though? I mean, there would have been an emperor of Rome, right? And they would have had massive wealth and resources at their disposal. And there were slaves and servants. I mean, wouldn't those members of society be way worse off than the lowest levels of society today? Yes, that's all true in absolute terms. Just the other day, we were walking around touring one of the palaces here in Edinburgh, and we walked into the king's bedchamber, and we were looking at the king's bed, and I was looking at it being like, really? That's the king's bed? That's what the king slept in? I mean, it looked like a child's bed. I wouldn't have fit in it, and you know, I am over 6 feet, but still, it literally looked like the bed of a child. And so it really put into perspective the fact that we today, many of us today who live in the developed world, we live far better lives than kings who lived just a few centuries ago. I mean, we have access to clean, cold drinking water whenever we want it. We get to travel in these crazy contraptions that we call cars or airplanes. I can treat most things with modern medicine that would have killed me before I even hit the age of 40 back then. The list goes on and on. But the catch is, on a relative basis, nothing has changed. What I mean by this is the gap that exists between the servants and the emperor of ancient times is the exact same gap that exists between the minimum wage earner and the techno-emperor of modern times. Yes, it's true, the collective living standards have gone, I guess it's this way actually, up and to the right, but the social gap, the social hierarchy has moved with it. The upper, middle, and lower class exists in very much the same way. It's just a little bit harder to see because everyone's living standards have gone up. And the fundamental aspect of the game that applies primarily to those who are at the lowest level of the social hierarchy, and this is something that has not changed in this span of time, is the fact that those people are subject to perform compelled labor. Today, the modern mechanism that the game uses to compel you is the need for money. But the very interesting difference about our most current version of this game, of which there will almost certainly be more versions into the future, perhaps even in our lifetime, who knows? The most interesting thing about it is that there is a large amount of fluidity that exists between the levels of this hierarchy. Someone who starts at the lower level can find their way to the top. This was not necessarily true or as true in previous versions of the game. And this is what I would like to discuss now. This idea that we can free ourselves from compelled labor and increase our freedom in society. To do this, you can play the game a certain way. And I believe the way to play it is to play according to the meta. For those of you watching who've played multiplayer games before, you'll know what I'm referring to. And for those who haven't, what I mean by this is simply that the meta is the best current strategy of the way to play the game for the best results. This term comes about because in video games, because all a game is a set of rules and parameters which leads to winners and losers and some type of reward distribution among that, there's always some type of strategy to play which gives you the statistical edge when it comes to playing the game, whether we're talking about a card game or whether we're talking about a massively online role-playing game. It's all the same. There is some type of strategy that works best based on the statistical probabilities. Now, in video games, what tends to happen is they get updated over time. So something called a patch comes out which slightly tweaks and slightly adjusts the rules of the game. So then players will go in and once again find that new strategy that optimizes to be the best way to play the game. Believe it or not, this concept, I believe, can actually be applied to many different aspects of life. Now, probably there's many different metas to the entire game of life, I guess you could say. But the current one I would like to focus on is when it comes to the career aspect of life. I believe there is a particular version of the meta that is very powerful, particularly for single individuals. And that is to participate in the information revolution. Now, I've discussed this in a series of videos, of which this one will become a video in that series. It's actually a playlist. You can watch the whole playlist if you're interested in what I'm talking about right now, but essentially it's leveraging the connectivity of the internet to earn a high income, be fulfilled doing so, and to become a sovereign individual. Again, I have a whole playlist on the information revolution, the sovereign individual. I break down these concepts into detail, and these videos actually build upon one another and flow into each other nicely. So highly recommend checking out that playlist if you are interested in the stuff that I'm talking about today. But when I said that word leverage just a few moments ago, I've come to realize that this is an essential component to playing the game right now with this current meta that I'm talking about. The ability today for one individual to have the power of thousands cannot be understated. But interestingly, I noticed that when I've been bringing up this idea of the information revolution lately, it's been a polarizing discussion, I would say. Either people recognize what I'm saying and they get inspired by it, which is my intention. After all, I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass. I am speaking from experience. I'm speaking from things that I've personally been through and done in my own life, which is part of the reason why I can speak to a lot of this with a lot of confidence. On the other hand, some people get angry with me and then they try and list all the reasons why they can't do this in their own life or that somebody else can't. Personally, I'm more interested in speaking with the first group. As I said in the beginning, I am not trying to determine what is best for everyone or what is best for society at large. Again, far greater people than me have tried and failed at that. I'm just sharing how I found my way through life, starting from a place that I did not like. And my hope is that it helps some of you out there who are in a similar spot. And if that's you, again, highly recommend checking out the playlist that I've put together discussing the information revolution, the sovereign individual, and keep your eye out for a future video where I want to go into more detail on this concept of leverage and how it's creating what I believe is the most powerful opportunity that has existed for a single individual to become a free human being in the past many thousands of years.